The smoke was not exhaust. It was the final, choking gasp of a shattered engine block, illuminated by the relentless flicker of tracers. On the freezing morning of October 14, 1943, deep over Schweinfurt, the skies were not blue. They were painted crimson and black by the blood and burning metal of the 8th Air Force. This was not a raid. It was a massacre, a terrifying testament to the cost of daylight bombing when the precision needed to justify the risk simply didn't exist. B-17 flying fortresses, the supposedly indestructible behemoths, were falling like tortured stones, sometimes 3 or 4 simultaneously, spiraling toward the Bavarian farmlands below. The mission target, the mammoth ball-bearing plants that kept Hitler's entire industrial war machine lubricated and rolling, was critical, non-negotiable. Yet, previous attempts, though brave, had often devolved into wasteful area bombing. The bombs dropped were often inaccurate, missing the hardened, vital structures by hundreds of yards. The price for this inaccuracy? 60 bombers lost in just this single agonizing day, crippling the 8th Air Force for months. This failure revealed a terrifying truth. American courage alone could not win the strategic air war. They needed a weapon that could translate raw bravery into surgical destruction. A piece of technology so revolutionary that it was guarded more zealously than the atomic secrets still being whispered about in Los Alamos. That weapon was hidden beneath a canvas shroud in the nose of every B-17, an electromechanical masterpiece known officially as the Norden Bombsight M-9. But to the men who flew, fought, and often died to protect it, it was simply the prophet. Its promise was biblical in its scope, to place a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality was a constant, desperate battle between human error, the fury of the enemy, and the limitations of physics. The sheer vulnerability of those early raids stemmed directly from the inaccuracy. If you could not guarantee the destruction of the target, you had to hit the target multiple times, meaning multiple missions, meaning exponentially higher casualties. The German war machine, particularly the Luftwaffe, was proving resilient precisely because the damage inflicted was reparable. The synthetic fuel plants, the aircraft assembly lines, the very factories producing the formidable cannon that ripped through the fortresses they kept running. The Allies were trading men for temporary dents in production, a trade they were rapidly losing. The Norden site was supposed to change this equation entirely. It was a complex analog computer, heavy with brass and glass, using gyroscope stabilization and sophisticated mathematics to calculate the exact release point, compensating for altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and even the Earth's rotation. It demanded absolute perfection from the Bombardier and, critically, demanded that the aircraft fly absolutely straight and level the bomb run. For several harrowing minutes, transforming the mighty flying fortress into the easiest target in the sky. If this complex machine could not deliver on its promise of precision, the entire strategic daylight bombing doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Forces was a magnificent, tragic lie, destined to drown in German flak. The secrecy surrounding the Norden site was legendary, verging on the absurd. Before any bombardier was even allowed to train on the M9, he was required to take an oath of allegiance and secrecy rivaling those sworn by high-level spies. They were told explicitly that if the aircraft went down over enemy territory, the Norden site was the single most vital piece of equipment, more important than the crew's lives, and must be destroyed immediately. Specialized demolition charges were built into the site's housing for this purpose. If those charges failed, the crew was instructed to use axes, thermite grenades, or even heavy machine gun fire to reduce the delicate components to useless scrap metal. This obsessive protection stemmed from the sheer technological advantage the Allies believed they held. The Norden wasn't just a site. It was the ultimate expression of mid-century analog computing power. When the Bombardier took control of the aircraft via the linked automatic pilot, the crucial autopilot function that kept the aircraft perfectly stable during the run, he was feeding the machine 4 primary variables: true airspeed, altitude, drift angle, and the target's pre-calculated ground speed. The most critical component was the stabilizing gyroscope, ensuring that the crosshairs remained locked onto the target regardless of the B-17's slight pitching and yawing movements. This was the magic. Unlike simpler optical sights, the Norden continuously calculated the trail, the parabolic path the bomb would follow, taking into account the immense atmospheric drag. It literally predicted the future position of the bomb relative to the moving target. Training was intense and deeply stressful. Bombardiers were indoctrinated not just in its mechanics, but in its almost mythical perfection. They were taught that if the wind data was perfect, if the aircraft held true, and if the release button was pressed at the precise moment the sight commanded, the bomb would hit the exact aim point. The pressure this created on a 20-year-old flying his 10th mission was monumental. He was the most protected man in the aircraft, hunkered down behind the plexiglass nose, but he also carried the entire mission's success, and thus the lives of the 9 men behind him on his shoulders. The pilots often resented relinquishing control to the Bombardier and the Norden, calling the final approach the milk run, because they had to fly straight and level, yet it was anything but calm. It was a terrifying exposure to the concentrated fire of the German air defenses. But without handing over control to the precise mechanics of the Norden, that pickle barrel accuracy remained unattainable. The sight symbolized the American strategic philosophy: victory through precision engineering and calculated risk, a direct contrast to the British focus on nighttime area saturation bombing. The inherent problem, however, remained. The Norden was useless if the target was obscured, and the weather over Nazi Germany was notoriously and perpetually poor. The initial deployment of the Norden over occupied Europe was met not with miraculous success, but with grim reality. The sight, brilliant on the clear skies of test ranges in the American Southwest, struggled mightily against the persistent high-altitude haze, fog, and pervasive cloud cover of the European theater. The official U.S. Air Force doctrine demanded clear visibility of the target. The Norden required visual lock to calculate its parameters. This meant that on nearly 70% of missions flown into Germany during 1943, the bomb run had to be executed either through inadequate breaks in the clouds or, worse, by dropping bombs entirely on instruments, relying on primitive radar or the lead bombardier's estimates, a method that immediately negated the Norden's precision capabilities. This disparity between the promise of the sight and its battlefield performance led to immense frustration and dangerous mission creep. Crews would often press deeper into German airspace, sacrificing time and fuel, just to find a window in the weather that allowed the Norden to operate as advertised. This desperation exposed the bomber formations to prolonged attacks by increasingly aggressive and heavily armed Luftwaffe interceptors. The German fighter pilots quickly learned the rhythm of the American daylight raids. They understood that the fortresses and liberators had to fly straight for the final few minutes of the bomb run. That moment of straight, stable flight, the Norden's moment of truth, became the most lethal phase of the entire mission. The Me-109s and FW-190s would time their attacks to coincide precisely with the bomb run, using devastating head-on passes where the B-17's defenses were weakest. The crews had to choose: maintain the perfect, steady course demanded by the Norden to achieve precision, or execute evasive maneuvers to survive the onslaught. Too often, survival won, and the bombs scattered widely across the German countryside. The 8th Air Force leaders, realizing the sheer impossibility of relying solely on visual bombing, were forced to adapt, but this adaptation chipped away at the core philosophy of precision bombing. The decision was made to use formation bombing, where only the lead aircraft, flown by the most experienced crew and bombardier, would use the Norden to aim and drop, with the rest of the formation dropping simultaneously on the lead signal. This concentrated the bombs but spread them across the target area rather than guaranteeing pinpoint accuracy for every bomb. It was a compromise born of necessity, but it highlighted the immense technological gap that still needed to be crossed. The sight was a marvel, but it could not pierce the heavy gray blanket of a German winter, and Hitler's defenses were exploiting that weakness mercilessly, turning the highly touted daylight raids into bloody battles of attrition. The men who operated the Norden sight were an elite fraternity, often viewed by the rest of the crew with a mixture of respect and detached curiosity. The bombardier's compartment was a sanctuary of complexity and immense responsibility. Unlike the waist gunners or the tail gunner, who were constantly engaged in the visceral dance of survival, the bombardier's work was analytical, mechanical, and intensely focused on the final, solitary act of the mission. The pressure was psychological, a deep, pervasive anxiety that only grew during the agonizing minutes of the bomb run. The sound of the flak exploding nearby, the vibration from the .50 caliber machine guns spitting fire just feet above their heads, the constant threat of an enemy fighter tearing through the nose plexiglass. All of this had to be filtered out. The bombardier had to become one with the Norden, meticulously adjusting the drift dials, cross-checking the altimeter, and ensuring the synchronization knob kept the target locked dead center in the viewing scope. Every tiny error in setting the initial coordinates or compensating for wind drift was multiplied exponentially over the 20,000-foot distance, potentially sending bombs a mile off target. The weight of this perfectionism was immense. Many bombardiers developed nervous tics or suffered from operational fatigue faster than other crew members, simply because the stakes of their failure were so immediate and complete. The maintenance of the Norden was also a ritual of near-religious devotion. The instruments had to be calibrated perfectly before takeoff, protected from bumps and extreme cold, and checked constantly. If the gyroscope spun even slightly out of alignment, the whole mission was jeopardized. It was a delicate instrument in the most brutal of environments. Stories abound of bombardiers arguing fiercely with pilots who dared to deviate even slightly from the straight and level path during the bomb run, often shouting over the intercom, demanding they hold steady even as cannon shells ripped through the wings. The successful use of the Norden was not a simple act of pushing a button. It was a complex synchronization of man, machine, and aircraft. The bombardier was the maestro, and the moment he engaged the autopilot and watched the synchronization crosshairs creep toward the target was the pinnacle of the mission. It was a moment of vulnerability, yes, but also a moment of singular, terrifying power. They were not just dropping bombs. They were delivering the strategic purpose of the entire U.S. Air Force campaign. If the Norden worked, factories vanished. If it failed, 10 men risked their lives for nothing, and the war dragged on. This intense focus on achieving the precision the site promised meant that these young men, barely out of high school, were entrusted with military and industrial secrets that could turn the tide of the war, adding another layer of psychological weight to their already impossible burden. As 1943 bled into 1944, the strategic bombing campaign faced an existential crisis. The high losses and inconsistent results confirmed that the initial strategy, hitting vast industrial regions and hoping to cripple production through collateral damage, was failing. Precision, the very essence of the Norden's design philosophy, had been compromised by weather and necessity. Furthermore, the early targets, though important, were often recoverable. What was needed were surgical strikes against irreplaceable infrastructure, targets so vital that their loss would guarantee the collapse of the German war economy, especially its air arm, the Luftwaffe. The moral argument for area bombing, which inevitably resulted in high civilian casualties, was also becoming harder to maintain, especially when the military results were so poor. The U.S. Air Force desperately needed to prove that its commitment to daylight precision bombing, spearheaded by the Norden, could achieve what mass night bombing could not: the targeted destruction of specific critical bottlenecks. The targets identified were the highly specialized industries: synthetic oil refineries, Hitler's army ran on ersatz fuel, aircraft assembly plants, and, most crucially, the ball-bearing factories. Without the precision promised by the Norden, hitting these small, hardened targets from 25,000 feet was literally impossible. It required the site to perform exactly as advertised, eliminating the massive margin for error inherent in visual estimation. This strategic pivot placed the burden of ultimate success squarely back on the young bombardiers and their brass instruments. They had to wait for the few fleeting days of optimal weather. When those days arrived, the missions were launched regardless of the anticipated German resistance. These were not raids of attrition anymore. They were aimed at delivering a definitive knockout blow. The entire focus shifted from merely hitting a city to specifically vaporizing a single building within that city. But here lies the profound tension. If the ultimate justification for the brutal risks taken in the daylight was superior precision, and that precision was achieved only through the technological miracle of a complex instrument like the Norden, what did that say about the nature of modern warfare? Were the moral costs of the strategic air war, the immense loss of life on both sides, justified only by the ability of a machine to calculate physics perfectly? Did the responsibility for the outcome shift from the generals planning the attack to the bombardier dialing in the wind speed? The U.S. believed the precision bombing campaign was morally superior to area bombing because it targeted military assets, but its success depended entirely on a fragile piece of technology surviving a flak barrage and achieving optical clarity. Was the burden of secrecy and precision too great for a single piece of technology and the young men operating it to carry? Or did the ethical requirement for precision justify the extreme risks? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Where did the ethical weight of precision bombing truly rest? With the military planners or the technical instruments designed to execute it? The German response to the increasing depth of the American raids was brutal and rapidly adaptive. As the B-17s pushed past the coastal defenses and deep into the industrial heartland, the Luftwaffe deployed its full might. The crucial need for the Norden to operate, which meant straight, steady flight, was perfectly exploited by German fighter commanders. They transitioned from simple hit-and-run tactics to coordinated, heavy attacks specifically designed to break up the tight bomber formations during the critical bomb run. They introduced aircraft armed with devastating 20mm and 30mm cannon, weapons that could tear the wing off a flying fortress with a single well-aimed burst. The famous box formations, designed to provide mutual interlocking fields of fire, became targets themselves. If the formations were forced to maneuver wildly to avoid fighters, the Norden's complex calculations became meaningless, forcing a scatter pattern drop or, worse, an aborted mission. The German fighter pilots were experts at identifying the lead bomber, the aircraft that carried the most experienced bombardier and was dictating the formation's course. They focused their efforts on crippling that lead ship, knowing that its loss would immediately throw the entire formation into disarray and degrade the accuracy of hundreds of following bombs. The intensity of these defensive efforts dramatically illustrated how seriously the Germans viewed the threat of precision bombing. They understood that if the US could consistently hit specific targets like the Messerschmitt assembly plants or the specific filtration towers of an oil refinery, the war would become unwinnable for the Reich. The Luftwaffe was betting on American inaccuracy and the sheer impossibility of maintaining perfect formation under concentrated fire. The bomber crews, meanwhile, developed desperate counter-tactics. They would use dummy bomb runs, faking their approach to draw out the flak and fighters before swinging back around, hoping to catch the defense reloading or momentarily off guard. But for the bombardier operating the Norden, this was agony. Every evasive action, every sudden lurch of the aircraft, required him to reset, recalibrate, and start the complex synchronization process again, all while watching the enemy fire stream closer. The paradox of the Norden was laid bare. To achieve maximum strategic effect, the crew had to endure maximum tactical risk. The survival of the bomber was contingent on the success of the bomb run, but the bomb run itself was the time of highest vulnerability. The escalating ferocity of the German air defense in late 1943 and early 1944 meant that the strategic bombing campaign was approaching a breaking point. The massive casualty rates could not be sustained. Something fundamental had to change, or the Norden, for all its technological genius, would simply become a footnote in a history defined by defeat. The shift came with the arrival of a true game-changer, not just for the bomber crews, but for the entire concept of daylight air superiority, the long-range fighter escort, specifically the North American P-51 Mustang. Until early 1944, the deep penetration raids that were essential for hitting the most vital German targets, the synthetic oil plants and the aircraft factories, were largely unsupported once the bombers passed beyond the range of shorter-legged escorts like the P-47 Thunderbolt. This left the B-17s and B-24s exposed to the dedicated, brutal attentions of the Luftwaffe. But the Mustang, fitted with external drop tanks, finally offered the range needed to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. This seemingly simple technological improvement radically altered the effectiveness of the Norden bombsight. With the skies now increasingly being disputed and often cleared of German interceptors by the aggressive P-51 pilots, the B-17s could, for the first time, fly their required bomb runs with a drastically reduced level of interference. The bombardiers now had the precious, uninterrupted minutes they needed to fine-tune the Norden, lock onto the target, and ensure a perfect, steady release. This newfound air superiority paved the way for Operation Argument, later known simply as Big Week. This monumental coordinated effort, scheduled for the third week of February 1944, was designed to deliver the decisive, crushing blow to the German aircraft industry that earlier, scattered raids had failed to achieve. The goal was unambiguous: destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to replace its fighters, thus clearing the skies permanently for the invasion of Europe. The operation demanded the combined effort of the 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force operating out of Italy. For the Norden to prove its worth, the weather had to cooperate, and during that fateful week, it did, providing crucial windows of clear visibility over targets in Brunswick, Leipzig, Ostersleben, and Schweinfurt. The pressure on the Norden operators was immense. They knew this was the strategic moment. Every crew briefed on the target lists understood that they were hitting the enemy's jugular. The success of D-Day itself rested on their ability to use this complicated piece of machinery to eliminate the German air threat. The fate of the ground war was riding on the precision of the U.S. airmen flying at 25,000 feet. Big Week commenced on February 20th, 1944, a cold, clear day that seemed tailor-made for the Norden site. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, covered by dense formations of P-51s and P-47s, streamed across the Reich. Unlike the costly, decentralized raids of the previous year, these attacks were synchronized, massive, and overwhelmingly accurate. The presence of the P-51s kept the majority of the German interceptors engaged high and away, granting the bomber formations the critical few minutes of stable flight required for the Norden to achieve optimal performance. The bombardiers, knowing they had visual lock and minimal interference, meticulously fed the data into their sights. The results were immediate and devastating. Factories that had previously shrugged off scattered bomb loads were systematically dismantled. At the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg, the main assembly hangars were reduced to smoking rubble. The synthetic oil plants at Merseburg and Palitz were hit with unprecedented accuracy, crippling Germany's fuel supply chain for months. The precision achieved during Big Week was the definitive proof that the Norden, when given the right operational environment, clear skies and air superiority, was the strategic weapon the U.S. had always claimed it to be. The centralized nature of German fighter production proved to be its greatest weakness when confronted with pinpoint targeting. The strategic planners weren't aiming at the part storage. They were hitting the final assembly lines and the critical stamping machinery, the places where disruption caused months of delay, not weeks. The sheer scale of the bomb tonnage delivered with high accuracy shocked the German high command. They realized that their ability to replace the massive losses sustained during the operation was critically impaired. The impact on the Luftwaffe was terminal. Within a matter of days, the German fighter force lost hundreds of pilots and aircraft, but more importantly, the industrial capacity to replace those losses quickly vanished. The Norden, operating at its peak, had fulfilled its mythical promise, delivering surgical destruction on a massive scale. It was the moment where the U.S. technological and doctrinal commitment to daylight precision bombing was finally, overwhelmingly vindicated, effectively crushing the heart of Hitler's air defense mechanism and setting the stage for the final phase of the war. The sustained precision attacks during Big Week and the follow-up missions demonstrated an irreversible degradation of the Luftwaffe's ability to wage a coherent defensive war. By March 1944, the strategic priorities of the U.S. Air Force shifted slightly from crippling production to directly eliminating the remaining operational Luftwaffe units in the air. The Norden had done its job by destroying the industrial base. Now, the long-range fighters were free to engage the enemy wherever they found them, knowing that German losses could not be replenished. This period marked the true establishment of Allied air superiority. The skies over Europe were no longer contested. They were increasingly dominated. The success of the Norden meant that fewer total missions were required to achieve the strategic objectives. If a ball-bearing plant was destroyed in one successful, accurate strike, crews didn't have to return repeatedly, thus saving thousands of lives and aircraft over the remaining months of the war. However, the site itself was beginning to face its own obsolescence, not due to failure, but due to the relentless march of wartime technology. The perennial problem of European weather remained. While Big Week had offered perfect visibility, many subsequent missions still flew under heavy cloud cover, forcing a reliance on radar-guided bombing, specifically the H-2X Mickey radar. The H-2X, while less precise than the Norden on a clear day, allowed for effective bombing through 10/10 THS cloud cover, ensuring that the strategic campaign could maintain pressure regardless of the weather. For the Bombardier, this was a philosophical shift. He was no longer staring down through a lens and manipulating a complex mechanism based on visual cues. He was interpreting fuzzy, circular radar scopes. Yet, the Norden maintained its value as the gold standard for accuracy. Whenever the visibility was good, the Norden was used, proving consistently superior for pinpoint strikes. The legacy of the Norden, therefore, is not that it won the war alone, but that it enabled the crucial turning point. It provided the technological basis for the American doctrine, giving the commanders the confidence to launch those deep, high-stakes missions, knowing that if the visibility was there, the bomb would hit its mark. It provided the impetus for the development of long-range escort fighters, as its effective use demanded air cover. By crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its factories, the Norden essentially neutralized the air threat over the invasion beaches months before D-Day. The final phase of the Norden's service life saw its original mission, secrecy and technological dominance, slowly dissipate as the war neared its end. By 1945, the site's design was widely known and its operational performance constraints understood. The incredible oaths of secrecy and the mandatory destruction procedures were relaxed. Yet, its contribution to the final Allied victory remains undeniable. It was the weapon that enforced precision in an age of mass destruction, forcing the enemy to constantly guess where the next crucial blow would fall. It was the tool that gave the young men flying those cold, terrifying bomb runs the confidence that their sacrifice was for a purpose, that they weren't just scattering explosives, but surgically dismantling the engine of tyranny. The true cost of the Norden's precision was paid not in dollars, but in the lives of the crews who had to fly straight and level through impossible fire to use it correctly. The story of the Norden bombsight is fundamentally a story about belief. The belief of engineers that they could tame physics, the belief of generals that precision could win the war, and the belief of the bombardiers who swore to protect a machine more valuable than gold. As the war concluded, the advent of jets, guided missiles, and true all-weather radar systems rendered the analog brilliance of the Norden obsolete. It was a product of its time, perfected at the moment it was most needed, bridging the gap between brute force bombing and the push-button warfare of the future. But standing back, looking at the devastation wrought upon the key industrial nodes of the Third Reich, particularly the aircraft production centers that never fully recovered after Big Week, it becomes clear that this forgotten weapon fundamentally crushed Hitler's ability to maintain air superiority, ensuring that when the Allied boots hit the sands of Normandy, the skies above belonged unequivocally to the liberators. It was the ultimate expression of the American commitment to strategic air power. If this story touched your heart and helped you understand the critical role technology and the immense courage of the bomber crews played in achieving air dominance, please consider subscribing to WWII Lore. We are dedicated to sharing the complex, heroic, and often untold stories of American aviation during the greatest conflict in history. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next mission briefing.